Welcome to the next episode of our Lives in Italy podcast, where we talk to famous people who also love Italy as much as us. Today's guest is Miranda Gore Browne, finalist in the first series of the Great British Bake Off.
And as I walked out of the tent, Andy Devonshire, who was our director, he went across the thing. So there's probably 45 people, crew and all of us guys. And he went, just let everyone know, Miranda's going to Deluge, back in a few minutes. I remember thinking, oh my goodness.
Okay, welcome to the next episode of Our Lives in Italy, and our very special guest this morning is Miranda Gore Browne. How are you this morning?
Very good, wishing I was in Italy.
There's still a chance. Come over, it's beautiful here. Fingers crossed we can all do it very, very soon. Good, so how's the weather in Blighty this morning? Fairly tropical, I've been reading so far?
Well, not actually today. No, we've had a bit of a heat wave last week, which was quite fortunate for us because we had to have the joy of isolating at home. So we were relishing having a big paddling pool, kindly donated by a village friend, and sunbathing in the garden, and actually it being beautiful weather. But it changed at the weekend, so we're now back to slightly grey, very typical British summertime, really.
Sort of grey and gloomy, typical sort of bank holiday British weather by the sounds of things.
It is rather, yeah.
Yeah, we're currently melting in 45-degree heat at the moment, which is slightly unbearable. But yeah, it's making me learn the Italian for various different ways of complaining about the weather. So now I can be very British, but in Italian, which is quite good.
I love that. That's fantastic.
Okay, so obviously you're sort of very famous. You came to the public's attention sort of during Bake Off, but we'll come to that later on in the podcast. So let's sort of be a bit Freudian, take you back to your childhood. So what sort of memories have you got about food as a child then?
Well, it's quite famous five, to be honest. Although we don't really refer to it as famous five, it's more Swallows and Amazons childhood. Anyone who's read Swallows and Amazons. So we were really lucky. I grew up here in West Sussex. I've moved away and come back to bring my children up here, our children up here. And so really, we had a camper van, a VW camper van, a K registration, and it had a pop-up stripy red and white roof with little bunks in. And I've got two brothers. We had a boat, a Skipper 14 for anyone who's in the sailing world, dinghy that we towed. And we were out and about lots, really. So we went to the local schools, but we were always up early at the weekend, knocking on friends' doors at about 5 or 6 in the morning, asking if they wanted to come up onto the South Downs to have bacon sandwiches for breakfast. We'd take the kite up. I remember vividly, cooking, being up there before anyone else was up there. Or we'd be down at the harbour, sailing, mucking about on kayaks, and then, piling into the van every time it started to chuck it down with rain. And, misty, steamed up camper van windows, fish and chips, if we were lucky, and then taking that abroad as well. So, in fact, we were very bohemian looking back on the pictures, with another family, friends of ours, who also had a camper van, and we would take them on the ferry over to Brittany. And that's, I suppose, really where the sort of real kind of food and adventures came from. That outdoorsy lifestyle, whether it be, very British pork pies, topped with applesauce on the shores of Derwent Water and Coniston Water, sheltering from the rain, or whether it was huge big pans of green beans cooked in the camper van, with jars of vinaigrette, and jumping in the sea to wash off all our sticky fingers. So I guess food was always very much part of my memories and of my childhood. We were very fortunate to have that kind of freedom to explore and to taste different things, even though I was quite fussy, did taste quite a lot of stuff.
So, I mean, is there anything sort of now that you wouldn't eat as a child that you would eat now? Or
lots. I have to check myself because I've got 3 children myself, and my eldest eats absolutely everything, and my next 2 don't eat everything. and I can sometimes hear myself, and then I think, I'm not sure I ate that when I was little. So I think there's quite a lot of things. I mean, I didn't eat a lot of spicy food when I was little, and now I love curries and Thai and different things like that, and I'm still not very good at it being very hot chilies. But I just think a lot of it's maturity, isn't it, growing up. And I think that, I often say to friends that it's important that the children see us eating it, even if they're not always trying it themselves. That is still part of it, isn't it, that exposure to it. And mine have loved pottering around huge big markets in France or Spain, and reminding me of what it was like when we were little, doing the same. It's all about exploring, isn't it, and trying, even if it's the touch of it and you're not prepared to taste it that day when you're little and fussier.
So that's really sort of where your love of food started, or was there anything else that sort of sparked it?
Well, yeah, and then I baked from when I was tiny, and always sort of having that freedom to try making different things and experimenting and adding different stuff. And I love that whole thing. I think it was probably from when I was very tiny, always sort of doing what I would call my food and baking prescriptions, thinking what people liked. And, my mum always used to make my dad a lovely sort of sponge flan with raspberries on from the garden, and things that were the personalizing of it and the things that make it special for different people. And we cooked a lot at home. My brothers and I live in different parts of the country now, but we can still stand in any of our kitchens and do a roast, whether it's Christmas lunch or just a Sunday roast, and all pick up at different parts of it, and you don't have to sort of like talk about who's doing what. We can just pull out this and know what needs doing, and pull out that. And they love cooking and food as well. So family lunches and having people over lots, and my mum always making lots of cakes, or even for when we were tiny, for christenings and birthday parties, food was always a huge part of it. The merry-go-round cake that my mum made, or we always had chocolate crispies, or she would always be making different kinds of things. And I think that's what connects us, isn't it? I never met my maternal grandmother, but my mum tells me that she made little rabbit biscuits and iced them and put them in little velvet bags with satin ribbons. She was a milliner by trade, but I'm one of the very few of my friends that does that and did that with my children for their parties. And there was my grandmother in the 1940s doing that for my mother's birthdays. And yet, we never met, but that's been a real connection. And I suppose for me then, food was always about much more than the food. It was about the coming together around the table, and, that slightly hectic, frenetic feeling in the kitchen of trying to get it all ready. And I can always remember when we had people to stay or people for lunch, that we'd help get it all ready and get the food ready, and then we'd all get on our bikes and we'd go right to the top of the lane and out to the top of the village to see when they were coming in, and when they arrived in their cars, we'd race them down to our house. That was all part of it, the family and the friends and the being together. And then I also always relished that, what would other people bring? I mean, I'm still have family friends from when we were little where I'll message the mum and say, what was that you used to make, or what did you used to put in that chicken casserole that we always had? And we always had Christmas Eve at another friend's house or at our house. And even from quite little, I can remember thinking, well, what are we going to eat? That whole idea of planning what we would put on the table and planning the different things. And then as I got older, more confident, having the freedom to do that. And I think that was credit to my parents. There was never any oh, don't mess up the kitchen, or there was never any, that knife's too sharp for you. I mean, to give you an example, my younger brother, who is now a professor of engineering, at 2 years old, my father bought him a tiny little toolbox and filled it with real tools, and he used to stand in the kitchen with a little tiny tool bench my dad had made, properly sawing, and we would have friends over, and they would really be quite horrified. I think they thought my parents were quite negligent. And my dad would be like, well, he's totally understands what he needs to do. I've shown him how to use a saw and a drill. And it's interesting because the same applied to their attitude towards food. Well, sailing, whatever it was, if you were old enough to be there and do it, then you needed to be chucked off the end of the jetty in your life jacket to test the life jacket. So if you weren't old enough to be on the end of the jetty and to swim and to be safe, then you couldn't go sailing if you couldn't be chucked in. So, and it was a bit the same with food, I think. I don't ever remember there being, my mum she worked as a teacher, like you guys, from when we were quite little. And I remember she used to leave a note on the kitchen counter, and it would say, could you go and buy everything to make a lasagna? And she'd leave £5, and I would go, it was quite a good walk down to the shops where we lived, and I'd go down to the shops, and I'd go to the butchers, and I'd buy 250 grams of mince, and she'd always say, get the ground steak, not the it's really interesting. And I knew what we would have in at home. I'd checked what we had in the fridge at home. Had we got a tin tomato, so And I'm not saying it was the standard of the amazing lasagnas that you'll be having there in southern Italy, but I came home and I would make it, and I was probably 10. And the same with roasts. My mum would buy a lovely piece of meat and a big piece of pork. Our butchers had a lot of local Sussex pork and lovely crackling, and it was learnt at her elbow. It was you slice the top of the crackling, don't forget to put the lemon and salt on, and I was doing that as a subconscious. So that whole, what we now call scratch cooking, is just being there, just absorbing it all and being allowed to do it. And my mum always used to say, well, the oven's been on for the roast, what do you want to put in it, whether I would make scones or a cake. Or when I was a bit older, I went through all of Delia's sections of different things I could make, fridge rolls, whatever, and that would be another coming back together, and we would sit and eat that in the garden later, or and if it didn't work, it didn't matter. No one minded. It wasn't about it looking a certain way. I was always fixing stuff up from when I was tiny. That comes into what I do now with all my mottos of when I teach and share my love of baking and cooking. I always say it's happily imperfect. It doesn't, people love it because you've made it. They don't love it because it looks like something from a factory or shop. So I guess that's all, it all weaves into that kind of like freedom of childhood, I suppose.
Just go in, get your hands dirty and have a go at it, and it'll probably end up delicious, but it just may not end up looking like the picture, for example.
I was talking to a friend yesterday, and her husband his mother was a really, really top cook, actually. And he was talking, and he said to me, completely kind of out of the blue, I haven't seen them for a while, it was their daughter's birthday, and we popped over to have a bounce in the bouncy castle before their, her party and friends arrived. And he said to me, there's the people that cook, aren't there? And there's the people who add a bit of them. And that's exactly what I always say, that you're putting a bit of you into it. And that's what people want. You must have seen that being out there in Italy with people and their generosity and saying, come and have this. And it could be the simplest thing. It could be that it's a huge, bucket of courgettes that have gone crazy in someone's garden and they've turned it into something so simple. We all crave that, don't we? Want to know, what have you put in it? How did you make it taste like that? What did you do to it beforehand? And that's what it's about. And also, not, like you say, not fearing it being something you would be judged for. And of course, I've had lots of judging of my food, and I've judged lots of other people's.
We'll come to that, don't you worry.
But not worrying, and hopefully that's something that we will bring as a real positive when people talk about positives from the pandemic. Hopefully that's what we will come back to. That the really important thing about it was us being together, and that it was about being able to show love through food, whether that was the biscuits you baked and put in a parcel and sent to someone, or the cake you left on someone's doorstep, or the fact that you got the kids zooming and cooking something together because they couldn't be together and they're cousins and they normally were able to celebrate their birthdays, or whatever it was. And I think that whole sense of bringing it back down to that really simple thing, which is we're coming together to be together, exactly. And the food is a catalyst for that. Food is why you come on, come and have this with us, or have you tried this? And hopefully that whole fear of thinking, well, have we got the right people? Have we invited the right people? Or have we got the right tablecloth? Or, does it look okay? Or is this actually my style? Is this how I want it to look? Actually, none of that really matters, because what people really want is to sit and chat over a bowl of soup, or a piece of flapjack, and actually see each other. And that, hopefully, that's what we will take from it, is that really simple message of what food really stands for.
It's one of the reasons I do this podcast. Just like everybody loves talking about food.
And, we all know, don't we, any of us that cook, that it isn't just standing there and putting stuff in a bowl. It is about what you add on top of it, isn't it? And that effort, and your wife standing there thinking through, well, what do we do the potatoes this way or that way? And how do we love it best? And what do we want to show them? And which potatoes did we get? And like you say about the sprouts, but, it's our traditions, isn't it? It's sharing so much more than just sitting there talking about it, because it's really there, isn't it? It's really living and breathing and eating it. Yeah,
as you said, it's sort of, and I say it's the little bit of love that you put into it as well. But I didn't make the same mistake with the meat order that I made the Christmas before, where I went into the local butchers and made a mistake as far as kilograms and pounds were concerned. Because my wife
too much or too little?
Far, far too much. My wife said, okay, what we need is we maybe need an £8 turkey for the amount of people we've got coming round. Because the first one we cooked was for a group of 15, I think it was. So I said, right, okay, go down to the butcher's, order an £8 turkey. In between me leaving the door and walking into the butcher's shop, I'd started doing the maths in my head to convert it into kilos and got it completely wrong. So I ended up ordering an 8-kilogram turkey.
Brilliant. That's my kind of turkey.
Yeah. So Christmas Eve went to pick it up, and then they suddenly brought out what looked like a plucked pterodactyl from the... and all the nonnas in the shop are going, brava, brava, brava. And I'm just looking at it going, Jesus wept. What
did it fit in the oven?
It had to be trimmed, I think.
Had to do that before.
Yeah, so the wings and the legs straight in the freezer. So it was just a turkey crown by the time we finished. But it was great, you know. It's never mind sort of turkey curry for Boxing Day. It was turkey curry in March by the time we'd actually got through it. But
oh, I love the leftovers. I think that's these things usually happen for a reason, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. Leftovers are generally sort of the best part of the meal. But before we get on to the bit that I think probably the listeners are nudging me towards, what about Italy? Because you mentioned Brittany before, but what about memories of Italy?
So my father worked for the railways, so we went lots and lots of places on the train. Night sleepers, went across Canada, went across France, went down to Italy, across to Scotland, put our camper van on, went to Scotland on the sleeper train. Because my father didn't have a company car, he had rail travel for us all. So that's what we did. So we went one Easter to Menton, which anyone who knows is right on the border of Italy, at the very bottom, south of France, border of Italy. And I can remember, of course, because we were on holiday with no car, we went everywhere by train, and we took a train across onto Ventimiglia and then up into the mountains. My dad would always have this little list of itineraries that we would be needing to do. Usually they involved hugely delayed connections so that he could see some certain specific station in some random place. We got wiser when we were older, and we would check and verify the schedules beforehand before we committed. But it would often mean that we ended up somewhere like, you know, a little rural stop, you know, and I can remember having amazing wood-fired pizzas on those first little forays into Italy, and also feeling that difference, you know, when you crossed the French-Italian border, you know, that whole sort of sense of excitement that we stepped into this other country. And then we would be dipping back because we were staying in a hotel, one of our very few hotel holidays in Menton. So I do remember that really well, and I remember that feeling of that whole sense of it changing. Like, it just felt more, I don't know, more, maybe a little bit more edgy, a bit more, I don't know, just more different attitude to food. I mean, obviously Menton has got a fabulous attitude to food. It's lemon festivals and beautiful Mediterranean food. So I do remember that. And then after I'd finished at university, we did a month traveling around Italy on train or by train. And I suppose that was when I really felt like I fell in love with Italy, having watched sort of, you know, A Room with a View, and, you know, always sort of loved that whole sense of the history and the architecture. And I just finished a history degree at Durham, so we literally just packed what we could have in a backpack and got the train across to Paris and get the night sleeper down to Rome. And if anyone's done that, I mean, it's just an experience to die for. And I mean, we had booked into a 6-berth couchette, which is one of the sleeping cabins, and had got there early enough, so on the concourse on the platforms at Paris had got onto the top bunks. And if anyone knows what it's like, you know, they're really tight to the ceiling, and then you have 2 more below, and you're only meant to have 6 people. I mean, you'd never get away with this in the days of COVID. 6
Not
people
anymore.
And as it sat in the platform, and it's quite a long time, you know, rumbling along, everyone loading up the train, everyone getting on, this cabin got fuller and fuller and fuller with this Italian family. And I think we counted that there were 9 of them in there with us. And they immediately flipped up the middle bunk, sat on the bottom bunk, got out a huge big, like, I can't remember whether it was a pan of pasta. They weren't cooking it, but it would have been, you know, like trays of pasta. Oh man. And we were sat on this top bunk, you know, with our bit of baguette with ham and cheese and some pan of chocolat and some supplies we'd got in Paris. and all night, you know, it was constant chat and family, and little tiny ones snuggled up with the older granny on the bottom bunk, and yeah, I mean, I don't think we got to Rome until sort of like 3 the next afternoon or so. It was quite a long journey, but it was an amazing insight, like almost, you know, like a privilege to observe it, sitting there on these, you know, top bunks, watching this whole. I think they handed us some stuff up as well. So, and then we went all the way around Italy. So we all on foot or on the train, and, you know, Rome and Siena, and we didn't have much money. We were kind of backpacking. Venice. Where else did we go? Verona, all around Lake Trasimeno and Perugia. Yeah, it was just magical, amazing, and that sort of really, you know, didn't have a lot of money, so sought out the really good restaurants that weren't very expensive, finding, you know, fantastic places to have ice cream in Venice that weren't going to break our bank and meant we had enough money still to get the train home. Yeah, it was amazing. So I guess that was my real sort of, you know, chance to, and also to feel the different regions a bit more, feel how it felt. You know, you and I have talked about that briefly before, about how, you know, different areas and how much friendlier it was, or, you know, the people who would see us walking with our backpacks. I mean, as Sisi, I can, you know, it's imprinted on my mind forever, arriving the train at Sisi and that clatter of everyone getting off and then walking through those sunflower fields on and on and on up, and seeing Assisi sort of rearing out. just amazing. You know, the people offering you a lift in their car coming up, and, you know, the friendliness of it all. So yes, even, I mean, a lot of them were touristy places, but some of them we sought out, you know, weren't, and were much sort of quieter and more, you know, simple. And yeah, it was just amazing. Just really good food, buying lovely stuff at markets, and, you know, getting there early, and, you know, meals in little tiny, not really hotels, pensions that we'd sort of booked in advance. And, you know, then some of them we turned up and had to move at the last minute because they weren't great, and finding other places. Yeah, it was just, amazing.
Yeah, it's sort of, as you say, just finding the different places to eat. Because if you go on the tourist trail, I mean, personally, you know, I mean, again, you know, it sounds perhaps a little bit snobby, but if I see a restaurant when I'm out and about in Italy that has a tourist menu, I give it a wide berth, because it's just not going to be great. My top tip for anybody is, when it gets to lunchtime, look for somebody in work overalls and follow them.
Great idea.
Yeah, because it's that they're going to be going somewhere cheap and going to be going somewhere good. So just tag behind them. Don't look too suspicious, but just keep them within sight and follow where they're going.
Well, and also I think that, you know, and I still think this now when we travel and, you know, when we finally get abroad again, is that, you know, it's not just the restaurants, is it? It's also finding the fantastic little bakeries that have got the wonderful stuffed pies or pasties that are very local or regional, or, you know, finding places that are doing, you know, the incredible cakes that just look exquisite, or the ones that just actually taste amazing, but are sort of made out of the back of someone's kind of kitchen on a corner somewhere. And, you know, actually, like you say, following that sniff, following that sort of trail of the locals, and knowing what to find. And it's a bit like you said about I think language and food are very similar like that, you know, not fearing your pigeon Italian letting you down, but actually thinking that as soon as you start talking about food and asking people where places are, that you are building that kind of relationship, and, you know, maybe a transient community, but it is still your community while you're staying there, isn't it? You know, asking where the places are that are special, and who's making what, and where did you get that from, and not worrying that people are going to think your language skills aren't up to standard. Is a bit like not worrying that your cooking skills aren't up to standard. It's the same thing.
Yeah, it's, as I say, it's again just sharing a mutual love, really. But it's you know, it's definitely a religion over here, food, and I think, you know, that's the way that we really sort of start off any conversation with people that we don't know. But I think it's, you know, a love of food and family. I think hopefully now, after what's happened, hopefully that sort of now becomes sort of universal around the world. But it's been coming all the way through the podcast. Bake Off. So that's where you obviously first came to my attention, being one of the trailblazers on the first series of the Bake Off. I mean, I've had a very little sort of bit of experience as sort of cooking on TV is concerned, because I appeared on this thing called Britain's Best Dish on ITV. So, any gossip to tell me, or anything that happened behind the scenes that might be of interest?
Well, I was very impressed that you've done your detailed research. You're being very modest about it, Craig, because I've had lots of interviews and I don't think anyone's ever asked me before. So there you go. So yeah, I mean, it was an incredible experience, but it was also totally crazy. And I think anyone who has done Bake Off recently or then will totally agree. It's like living in a parallel universe, except we didn't live in it. We dipped into it and then came back to our normal crazy life. And at the time I had a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, so you can imagine it was quite a surreal exchange. I mean, it was we were very green and we were very naive. It was the first ever series of the Great British Bake Off. We even had to sign a contract that said if it never went to air, then we had no redress on that, because it was really very much a trial for the BBC. They were very limited budget. We knew nothing about how it was going to work or be structured. So Paul Hollywood has always taken great, I won't say great pleasure, but has often teased us and said, it's much harder now, it's much more competitive. But the difference for us was that we had no idea what was going on. And I put that in context, and two things that people don't often believe is true is that the first morning we were woken very early. We'd gone to stay in a pub in the Cotswolds, and we woke very early, all piled into a minibus to be taken to location. And we turned up in Kingham, and on the village green in Kingham was a huge marquee, and we all sat there in the minibus and said, well, that's nuts. How can we possibly film today if there's a village fete going on? So we didn't even know that we were filming in a tent. Okay, if you think now how much of a part of the Bake Off brand and identity a tent is, that was quite significant. And the first weekend of filming, so we filmed one episode over one weekend, so 2 long, very long days of filming, all of the recipes, all the continuity and everything, probably 14-hour days, I would probably imagine, maybe 12-hour days. And the first weekend of filming, we had to do all our own washing up. We had foot pump sinks at the end of the worktop, which you had to share with one other person, and you had to wash it all up, and that took up most of our time. So we did feedback about that last weekend, but none of us had done any TV before, obviously. You're on camera the whole time, so I counted at one point, I think the most I had was 9 cameras pointing at me, going around the room. Everything you say is recorded. If you say that you need to pop to the loo, which was for us a portaloo in the field, or we were very lucky in Mousel, we had the public loos on the quay, but we had to wait in a queue with the people who'd come off the beach with their kids, which was relaxing. Again, something that people don't often believe, but it is true. So as you would go out to go to the loo, you would say to one of the producers, I just need to pop to the loo. And I remember walking out of the tent once in Sarr in Kent near the windmill, and we had a very blowy day, and the portaloo was at the corner of the field. And as I walked out of the tent, Andy Devonshire, who was our director, he went across the thing. So there's probably 45 people, crew and all of us guys. And he went, just let everyone know, Miranda's going to the loo, back in a few minutes. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness. And they always used to say to you, flick off your power pack, your recording pack. So you went to the loo. And I always trusted that they would stop recording. But even little things, it took me probably 3 weeks of 3 episodes of filming, and I remember standing there and saying to one of my other competitors, what I don't understand is when it's all going really well, nobody comes over to have a look at what I'm doing, and when it's not going very well, everybody's there. Like literally the minute it starts to go wrong, it's like they've switched on a magnet, and you've got like producer, cameraman by your feet filming it, someone asking you what's going wrong. And this fellow contestant looked at me and he went, well, you could try to stop talking to yourself and then they wouldn't know it's going wrong. And I was like, oh my goodness. It was like one of those absolute epiphany moments. That'll be why. So when I'm saying to myself, I'm going to have to start this caramel again, it's not working, they're like, right, cameras 5, 6, 7, 8 on Miranda. Get someone over there and ask her why it's not working. And of course it really then wouldn't work. But I think what you're nudging at is that what I didn't find out until quite a long way into the filming was the first weekend that we filmed was Cake Week, and we'd been filming all day, very long day. It was very cold, bizarrely, it was summer, but very cold in the marquee. There'd been no budget for heating. We were all shivering and had got our ovens open to keep us warm while we did. And we did the last technical challenge, and I was just exhausted, really, and takes quite a lot for me to get a bit upset, but just the whole thing had just been too much. I'd had a whole week the week beforehand with people filming at home and assessments in London. I'd got 2 tiny children, trying to get packed up to go away. I was obviously worried about them with me being away. My littlest was only 2. And we did a challenge which was to make a Victoria sponge, which in everybody who does baking would probably have thought that was very easy for Miranda. Why could that have been a problem? And when it came out, it wasn't how I wanted it to look, and in confidence, I went to the side to speak to one of the senior producers who I'd known because we'd done weeks of assessments and competitions and judging. I knew this girl really well. And I said I wanted to just have a 5-minute kind of like a bit of wise counsel with her. I'd not done TV before, and this is what they'd said to us to do, that if you felt anxious, like you knew it wasn't going to, how would you going to handle it, because you were really tired and didn't want to feel like you were getting overly upset about something like a little cake. Anyhow, so I stood and talked to her, had a bit of a heart-to-heart with her at the corner of the tent, and I looked over her shoulder, and there was a camera on me with the red light running. And I said to her, "Oh, am I being filmed?" And they said, no, everyone was like, no, being filmed. And I was quite upset because, obviously filming is a very intrusive thing, isn't it? And we all put ourselves out there, but we were all sort of, very new to it. And anyhow, so I said I wasn't going to talk anymore because I obviously was being filmed, and what they were trying to do was trying to get this lovely inside emotional story, but I felt like that they were impinging upon my sort of confidence, I suppose, and my trust. So what I didn't know is we all went to pack up then at the end, finished filming for the day, went to go back to get food and stuff, and I then bumped into Sue Perkins in the Village Hall loos. It's all very glamorous behind the scenes. The first series of Bake Off.
It's all about loos, this. I don't know.
Sorry about that. Well, this is where you have interesting conversations. And she said something to me about, was I okay? And I said, well, I'm just a bit upset that this has happened. And weeks later, I'll find out, and anyone who's read Sue Perkins's autobiography, I found out actually travelling back on a train with Mel from one of the filmings, I think it might have been after we'd finished filming at another event. And it turned out that they felt the same as me, that they felt that we were sort of not being treated enough with, not kid gloves because we were all grown-ups, but that it was a big deal for us, and that they went off, and it turned out, I didn't know, but they had a massive heart-to-heart with the production company and their agent. And as Sue says, I think in her autobiography, they had actually discussed whether or not they felt that it was the right show for sort of them to be involved with, but I didn't know any of that at the time. I just went back exhausted and sort of was persuaded to come and have something to eat, and food cures a lot of stuff, doesn't it? We were quite direct the next day, and we said to the production crew about how we'd all felt that we had this trust thing, and it set a lot of boundaries in place probably for Bake Off filming now even, and also we talked a lot and had a big session with them all about how for us baking was about love and kindness and community, and that we wanted to be able to help each other out if it went wrong. And you often see that on Bake Off now, and at the time I think maybe they thought it was going to be more of a tough competing against each other, whereas for all of us it was really about sharing what we loved. And we loved the fact that if someone's pie or pudding collapsed, that we could rush in and help them, or if our oven broke, we could put our stuff in someone else's oven, a bit like you would have done with your neighbours in lockdown, or we would have done that kind of sense of caring and community. So I suppose it entrenched that, and hopefully that's something that has lasted within the way that the Bake Off is, and why we actually all love the Bake Off, because it is that sense of, yes, it's a competition, of course it is, but everyone also is enjoying the companionship of baking and cooking together, aren't they? Well, what it also did was that it made us very close to Mel and Sue, because it felt like they were our advocates and that they were part of our team, because of course they straddled it, didn't they? They weren't our judges, and actually what I think it then brought out was that they realised that they needed to nurture and nudge, and the actual, all of that really did happen, the stealing of the ingredients. Mel helping herself to handfuls of my chocolate and then going, "You didn't need this, did you?" And I was like, "Yes, I did, Mel, but I know what you're like now, and I've got a spare lot in my bag." And so all of that actual like you say, camaraderie between them and us as well, between us and Mel and Sue, and I think that has echoed through into the way that those roles have developed within the show. So even though the personalities have changed, you still see, don't you, you still see those presenters, whoever they are the ones that are loving, supporting, caring, coaching those contestants. And hopefully some of that has been a bit of a hangover from that sort of, maybe that forced the issue a little bit more, made us really think about those roles within it, because when you're doing something new like that, it's not always just easy to see that, is it, and how that will grow and develop.
So obviously then you finished Bake Off, but I think it's safe to say that you've not been sitting on the settee since Bake Off. You've had your fingers in a few pies, perhaps?
Yes, indeed. So actually, when I finished the Bake Off, I'd sort of just put my head down and pushed on, and I never thought that I'd even get past the first episode. Never thought I'd get on the show. So I went on it and I just thought, I'm just going to try and love it and enjoy it and get on with it. And it was stressful and quite difficult. But at the very last bit where I left the show, Mary held me by the hand and said I reminded her of her when she was little. And it was a really powerful thing. And I hadn't realised how Mary had been backing me and fighting for me, and could see, I suppose, stuff in what I was doing, and I'm a bit modest about it, but could see my talent and my taste and stuff. She loved my stuff, and Sue actually then took me to one side after that bit of filming when we'd gone off air, and she said, "Look, don't forget this, because this is Mary Berry telling you this, and sort of there is something really special here, and you haven't seen that relationship, as in you haven't seen how she's advocated for you haven't seen how she's backed you, how she's loved all your stuff, but she has, and she really wanted you to win, and she really wanted you to run with this." So when it all finished filming, we hadn't really ever had any chance to sit down and talk to Mary and Paul, other than sort of casual at the catering van, and not a huge amount of sort of like one-on-one time, obviously, because they were trying to keep it a bit of a distance with us and the judges. We got to know them really well, but not on a personal level. So when we filmed the final, Mary said something about, "Oh, I'm really cross if you don't do something with this. You've got lots of talent. You really must do something with this." And it's funny because I hadn't really thought about that. I'd been so immersed, when we did it, I was so immersed in just doing it and getting through it and looking after two children when I got home, and we were having to prep all the recipes in between the different shows, and it was just crazy. And I think driving back for the final, I thought, well, it's not really like my style, but I think I'm going to write to her. And I wrote to Mary, and I said how much it meant to her that she'd said these things, and I said, "Look, I just wondered if I could come at some point and come for a cup of tea and just ask you some advice on this, because it's complete, I'd worked in M&S for 14 years in management roles and project management roles. I had worked in food a bit, but not in creative food roles, and it's this whole new area, and I wanted to know what she meant, like, don't waste this, and what should you do with it." And so it was quite astonishing. She said, "Yeah, I'd love it, come over." And I drove to her house and thought of all these questions, what I was going to ask, and it was really amazing and surreal and really down to earth. I was sat in her office behind her kitchen with Lucy Young, and they were really honest, and they said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I "Well, I don't know." But anyhow, what I had really loved was that I'd loved having my recipes in a book, and although I'd loved the experience of the TV, and I loved being on camera, there was also something incredibly lasting about this whole thing that we'd had our recipes in the cookbooks. And I said, "Well, I'd call me crazy if I say it, but I'd really love to do a book." And she said, "Well, have you got any ideas?" And I got this idea for a biscuit book. I looked very carefully with my commercial head on from M&S, and there wasn't anything in the market. And I'd done my decorated biscuits, and Paul had said I could have served them at the Dorchester, and
I think Mary also said so you were the queen of iced biscuits during the show as well.
Yes, so there was a real sort of like point, and I said to her, well, look, I had sort of thought, do you think this is crazy? But, I sort of thought I'd quite like to do a book on biscuits. And she said, well, I think that would be a great idea because it's a really narrow area. Not many people have covered it. And she said, but, you these are the hard truths of how difficult a business it is to get into. You'll need an agent, such and such. You should do it. And actually, she was very direct. She was amazing, very direct. I had lunch in the kitchen with her and Lucy and her husband, one of her assistants, and her 105-year-old mother. And the assistant had made a quiche, and we had that. And yeah, it was just amazing. And I went away, and actually I was sort of quite, maybe it's too competitive. And she emailed me, or Lucy emailed me the next day and said, look, I'm sorry, really direct. It's hard business to get into, but we thought, you've done stuff in business, and you need to know that these are the challenges that will lie ahead. And she talked to me about how she'd done a lot of books before the first book started selling a lot more, and she said never sell out on what you believe in. Stick to, if you get approached by brands and you don't like their stuff, don't work with them. Work with things that really resonate with you. Always do your absolute best piece of work, because you never know, the one piece of writing that you'll submit to something that you think is small and insignificant might be the one thing that then gets picked up and people run with, and that becomes your voice. So she did all of that, and she'd said to me, look, if you want to do a book, you need to get an agent. And she didn't give me contacts. I just went away and then spent about 4 months literally boring everyone senseless. Do you know anyone who works with a book agent? Do you know anyone who's a literary agent? And on and on and on. And then was recommended through a friend who had worked a bit in TV and stuff, someone I could contact, and then they wouldn't take me on because of conflict of interest with another person that they were working with. And then I got put in touch with an agency, and I went up, and it turned out they went, something about Mary, and they'd worked with Mary on BBC books. And so they said, well, tell us what you've got, and if, kind of whatever. And they really liked my book proposal. So we ended up working together, and they got me in. The publishers liked my book proposal, and they got me in interviews with quite a lot of publishers, and I ended up having really exciting, having like 2 days in London, going to HarperCollins and Penguin and Mirandas. I mean, just amazing, sitting there talking about my book. This is my book. And obviously it's still not a dead set. And then had an amazing phone call where we had 2 different publishers pitching for it, and I got a deal with Ebury, who are part of Random House, to do a 2-book deal, and not knowing at the time what the second book was. So that was sort of what kept me busy to begin with. So I launched straight into writing my biscuit book. I did that, and then I was also pregnant with my littlest, so he was unsurprisingly a 9-pound 12-ounce baby after having had quite a lot of biscuits. And I worked a lot with Kenwood and growing my brand in different areas. Did quite a lot with Sainsbury's magazine, lots with got some lovely book reviews when my book came out. Launched it in Fortnum and Mason's. It was all very sort of amazing, and then went quite quickly on to doing I think I had a year, renovated and gutted the house here, built a big kitchen with a salon to do teaching and filming and stuff in. Started my kitchen school. And then, it's just been also, did another book, my cake book, Bake Me a Cake as Fast as You Can, appropriately enough. And if anyone ever asks if you can make them fast, you can, because I used to have the builder standing in the doorway saying, I'm turning the power off in an hour. So do what you need to do. Me with a 1-year-old disappearing under the floorboards and the house being cut up behind me. Yeah, and then it's just gone on and on. I've done lots of different things. Run a kitchen school here, done lots of Zoom classes during lockdown, do a food column for NFU Countryside, which is very much in keeping with my sort of like simple seasonal food memories, that kind of messaging. And just, I love it. Never thought that I'd end up having my thing that I'm passionate about being what I do every day, day in, day out.
Yeah, as I say, sort of having a job where it's actually something you love, it's just an amazing thing. But what about, you obviously like cooking. I think that's taken as read. But if you could have a meal out wherever you wanted to, what would be your favourite meal?
Okay. Well, it would have to be by the sea. Mm-hmm. So location's really important. And I'm a bit like Heston Blumenthal like that. I need to have the sea fret. It doesn't have to be hot and sunny. It can be wild and windy, but I love that whole thing. The seaside is really important to me, so it would have to be by the sea. And then it would have to be as fresh as possible. So it would either be the, freshly caught langoustine, or, amazing crab, or, I mean, if it wasn't by the sea, it would be by the water, maybe a lake, one of the lakes in Italy or in this country. And then it would be super fresh. It would be, I mean, ideally a seafood platter, because I'm quite indecisive. So I'd like to be able to pick through lots of different things.
You'd love it.
I might have to check you're not stealing mine.
You'd love it down here. That's a speciality. It's just like loads of sea fish on a plate, but go on.
Wonderful. Yeah. So I love that, and love the fact, all beautifully arranged. I can, sort of like when they put it on a big cake stand almost in the middle, I think that lovely styling of it as well is part of it, isn't it? That realness and that freshness of it. And then, gorgeous lemons, beautiful crusty bread that's been made that day, with that whole, knowing from my own commitment to sourdough and bread making, what's gone into that, and that, that taste of that. And then gorgeous homemade mayonnaise or whatever dressing or sauce that is that local speciality that, people would be dipping that seafood into. And then am I allowed to talk about puddings? Because that's really important as well.
Obviously, yeah.
Good. Yeah, and then it would, obviously I adore that whole sort of like what people make with their local seasonal fruit, whether that's the really juicy dripping peaches or the lemons or the local almonds and nuts and, chocolate. Anything chocolatey is a hit for me. I love that whole, what varieties of things are people making, whether it's the, hazelnuts that have been toasted and roasted and mixed with chocolate to make amazing tarts. So, that whole sense of being connected to where you're living, staying, eating, being, and having someone telling you about it as well. That not, it doesn't, for me, it doesn't need, I mean, I love a beautiful restaurant and white cloths and fantastic waiters dressed up like penguins. I love all of that, but I don't need that, someone cooking that for me on a barbecue or helping them get wood on a deserted beach that we've kayaked to would be incredible as well.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, something from and of the land and the sea has just got that special thing to it. So, talked about your history. What about now then? So hopefully now we're coming out of the pandemic, fingers and everything else that isn't painful crossed. What about your plans for the year then?
Well, now I've survived homeschooling and 3 of them here busy me teaching and doing all that kind of stuff. Well, the thing that I'm really prioritising at the moment is actually my podcast, which is very exciting. So I've been busy trying to record a few bits and lining up some interesting people. I've been very fortunate to meet a lot of fascinating people in this whole world of cake and baking and food. And really it's about sharing that. And it's called More Than Cake. So I have been doing a lot of work during lockdown about sort of defining what I stand for, and it's very much about simplicity. So it's simply Miranda, it's more than cake, it's a philosophy for life. So it's about life and childhood and food and memories and the seasons. It's not just about food, it's not just about cake. And so the podcast is called More Than Cake because cake is such a catalyst for so many things, and it's really, I guess, a podcast about the power of cake, of how it can create conversation. It can bring in words and emotion when it's too hard to talk. It can change people's lives because it can give them focus in bouts of depression or isolation or lockdown. It can communicate in a different way. When we bake together and stand side by side, there's a lot of evidence about how the whole process of cooking and baking side by side, because we don't need eye contact, can perform a sort of therapy and a form of togetherness that perhaps we can't reach when we're sat down trying to counsel a friend or trying to support. It creates it in a different way. It can be quieter and more companionable. So yes, I had someone say to me that, was I going to be the Stacey Dooley of cake? So that was quite an interesting one. And it's a bit about the poking under those layers of sticky icing to find out what that secret ingredient is and how people have translated that into life. So it took me a long time after I did the Bake Off to know that it was okay for my cakes to be a bit wonky and not to be perfect and not always to look like magazine cover cakes, because what people loved about them was the fact that I'd made them for them and that I'd picked flowers from my garden that were edible to put on top, and that I'd thought through the fact that they might like to have blackberries in the jam because they were mad about Peter Rabbit and it was for a birthday party, or, you know, the fact that my mermaid might not have been perfect, but I made sweet little mermaid biscuits that went on it because that was my thing, and that was something that they could then have the next day and the children could take home from the party. So yes, it's about much more than cake, and it's conversations with people over cake, sometimes making cake, and often about how their recipes for life have been founded through what they've learnt with cake.
Excellent, brilliant. So I quite like that phrase, poking under the icing. I'm going to use that more in conversation, I think. I quite like that. Well, thank you very much, Miranda Gore Browne. You've been very, very generous with your time today. It's been an absolute joy to speak to you today. Good luck with the podcast. I warn you now, it is very, very, very addictive. Very addictive indeed. But as I say, as soon as it comes on wherever, I'll be hitting the subscribe button. So have a fantastic weekend, whatever you're doing this weekend. And thank you very, very much again. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.
Thanks to Miranda for being such a wonderful guest. Don't forget to have a look at our show notes for links to our website and a cooking school. Our next guest in 2 weeks' time is Gina de Blasio, Neapolitan and lover of all things Italian. If you like what you've listened to, please review, comment, and maybe rate us 5 stars to spread the word. Please also subscribe so you get your next podcast the minute it comes out. Allora dopo!